Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
What's that thing they always say? Happy days are here again. That's what I hear anyway. And this is Half the Answer, where understanding a question is, in fact, half the answer. So I hear from the experts. So I am Caitlin M. Green, linguist, editor, person about town, and with me is, of course, Trent Nelson, historian, philosopher, editor, writer, awesome person. No hat today. I don't know what to do. So Trent, who did you bring for me?
Well, it's wild. Sometimes we wear many hats, sometimes we wear no hats at all. But in any event, we're always bringing the heat. And well, today is no different. Today I have brought you, Caitlin, a wonderful friend of not only mine, but of ours, Layla, al-Sheikh. They are a Palestinian American organizer, writer, and commentator who analyzes U.S.-Palestinian relations and public opinion surrounding the Palestinian liberation struggle. They recently launched a new blog entitled To Our Land, and they have pieces in places such as Foreign Policy, Dissent, the Center for International Policy Journal, and A More Perfect Union, and so we have heard Liberal Currents. Wonderful stuff from Liberal Currents. Layla, how are you today, my friend?
I am doing well. How are you?
Always wonderful to catch up with you. Thank you so much for finding some time to catch up with us. Well, today I wanted to speak about not only Israel and Palestine, which we are going to get to first off, of course, but many nations in the Middle East and their relations with the United States, primarily Iran and Saudi Arabia. And well, Layla, before we get into anything, could you give us a bit more background? Your biography was wonderful, of course, but the people, they crave background lore, as you're familiar with. What can you tell us about how you've got here before we get into Palestine and Israel and how that whole thing has unfolded historically and what we're dealing with today?
Certainly. So I am Layla. I am a Palestinian American who hails from a family of refugees and people who came to the United States during the 1990s. My heritage comes by way of Jordan and by way of Palestine itself, with my family being expelled from their homes in 1948 during what is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, the tragedy, in which 750,000 Palestinians were emptied out of historic Palestine. And many of them ended up in Jordan, wherein most were afforded citizenship and were allowed to live something of a more normal life. And eventually, my family made the decision to move to the United States. I'm born and raised here. During my formative years, saw the rise of political figures like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So naturally, I inclined towards the political left, the left liberal currents, those sorts of things. And in the wake of 2020, with the George Floyd uprising, COVID, and whatnot, I've become pretty solidified in this left element, I would say. And obviously, my main priority as a Palestinian, as someone who's in exile in the Western Hemisphere, is Palestinian liberation, what that means to the world, what it means in relation to the United States, which is the primary patron of the Israeli state, and the broader Western security architecture that exists in the Middle East. And so that's what I've focused on for the last few years, and certainly over the last 600 days or a year and a half or so, in the context of the war in Gaza.
Right. That's very helpful. Thank you. And I have to say, you've been a really welcome voice on Blue Sky, where I think there's not a lot of sort of like long-term analysis or deep analysis of the situation in that region. And so I want to thank you for providing that both on Blue Sky and in your blog. And in the Liberal Currents Discord, which of course patrons can join.
Hey, that's a true fact. So Layla, I mean, you mentioned 1948 and the Nakba, which is of course pivotal to understanding all of this. But could we go back even a little bit further with you? Could we talk about how all of that was able to occur? What happened in the prior 50 years to sort of create the groundwork for what your family went through?
Yes, certainly. Many people, in my experience, as a Palestinian in a country which, by and large, still to this day, although it is changing in recent years, does not understand the Palestinian experience on any level, certainly in comparison to the Israeli Jewish experience. Many people do not understand the trajectory of historic Palestine in relation to modern nationalism. And it's perhaps most important to begin an analysis of the current situation, of the current logjam and the impasse with the rise of Zionism, which is a modern nationalist ideology, not, and I feel the necessity to emphasize, not a multi-millennium long national aspiration, but a modern manifestation of nationalism, which developed in the late 1800s and was formulated in large part by European Jews who understood that persecution was endemic in Europe and that Jews did not experience anything approaching equal citizenship or a shared stake in the polities of Europe, certainly not in Russia, certainly not in Eastern Europe, certainly not in Germany or France or the United Kingdom. And Zionism developed in response to this. And Zionism looked at various places in which a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state could be established under a variety of formulations, some binational, some exclusively national, something in between. But the predominant form of Zionism, as is understood today, was first developed in large part by the likes of Theodor Herzl and the World Zionist organization, the World Zionist movement. And eventually, they centered their struggle, their aspirations, on establishing a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine, a sort of notional return to the place that they had been exiled from millennium ago.
Right.
But this was a decidedly secular struggle, not a religious one at the time anyway. And in that context, in the wake of World War I, with the Ottoman Empire's demise, British politicians, French politicians, German politicians, who both were more sympathetic to Jews than Arabs, and certainly to Palestinians who were not yet conceptualized as a distinct national group by the colonial powers. Right. They saw it as an opportunity to both give something to Jews and also to sort of solve what was colloquially known as a Jewish problem. This idea that Jews are a distinct group who can never be a shared stake in the polities of Europe. And so the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, which staked out the goal of establishing said Jewish homeland, with only very passing mention of the Arab inhabitants of historic Palestine, who were, at the time, a majority of the population. And these are people who have lived there for centuries, alongside a small, but nonetheless still significant Jewish minority of people who had remained. In the following years, after World War I, Palestine was put under the mandate system, in which the inhabitants of historic Palestine, along with Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt and Jordan, were not given the right to administer their own affairs. Under the auspices of British and French oversight, they were supposed to develop eventually into something of an independent set of states. This was the case with the Mandate of Palestine, which was nominally supposed to become an independent state of Palestine. But with Jewish migration and with competing aspirations of statehood, of sovereignty, of exclusivity, this would not come to pass. There would not be a single state. There were plans for partition put forward in the 1930s, which were resoundingly rejected by the overwhelming majority of Arab inhabitants of Palestine, but were tepidly accepted by the Zionist movement. on the understanding that they could eventually expand this state that they were being offered. And in 1936, the Palestinian inhabitants revolted against British rule, and this was resoundingly crushed. This had a debilitating impact on the Palestinian middle class, on the burgeoning bourgeoisie of Palestine, and it would perhaps be a prefigurative fatal blow for Palestinians in the following decade, with many of the leadership of Palestine either exiled or done away with. In the 1940s, with the Holocaust, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I cannot recall the number off the top of my head, of what were called displaced persons, Jewish displaced persons in camps around Europe, who were not allowed to return to their homes, who in many cases did not want to. They either wanted to go to America or to Palestine. And so the first Aliyah occurred, and the state of Israel was established via the UNSCOP partition plan, or the United Nations Select Committee on Palestine, which adopted a partition plan that gave a significant portion of historic Palestine to the minority Jewish population. I feel it necessary to emphasize this. It was a majority of the land given to a minority of the inhabitants. Whatever one feels about partition today, with hindsight, one of the main reasons partition was rejected was because it was done without the consent of the majority of the population. It was, whatever one feels about it, a endeavor undertaken by American, British, Soviet, French, and so on to be imposed onto the majority population.
Right.
And in wake of this, with the ongoing civil war in Palestine, which had already been occurring, the Nakba happened, the emptying out of historic Palestine of its Palestinian inhabitants, 750,000 or so. This was at the time the majority of the Palestinian population of Palestine. This took place in part via pre-planned operations such as Operation Dalit. This took place in part via fear of reprisals, with many Palestinian Arab inhabitants fleeing their villages. And this took place in part because of the nature of warfare. There's always going to be some form of displacement. But something I've told classes before when I've talked about the Nakba is that ethnic cleansing has two key elements to it. There is first the displacement, that is perhaps what most people focus on. But then there is a key element that is often not discussed, and that's the removal of the right to return or the prevention of return to those places that people were displaced from.
Right.
And this is what occurred in the immediate aftermath of the establishment of the State of Israel. Laws were passed which prevented the return of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. People who attempted to return were either shot or turned away, and land was expropriated en masse. And today, even though 80% or so of the villages which were depopulated in 1948 are still not inhabited, they have not been built over, they largely have trees or overgrown vegetation over it. Even though those areas are not inhabited today, people are not allowed to return. That is the central part of what ethnic cleansing is.
Mhm.
And that is in large part what the conflict today is about,
Sure.
certainly from the Arab perspective.
Right.
So I have a question about the Zionist movement in its early days, right? So we have like Theodore Herzl, who famously experienced anti-Semitism in his home and then moved to France and found even more anti-Semitism there and was watching it rise and rise and, you know, seeing the dark impulses of like ethno-nationalism. And his response was to say, we got to create this state in like that's far removed from Europe, that's in our sort of ancestral homeland, right, of Israel. And was there any kind of conversation about this idea of like, is it okay to use ethno-nationalism to protect ourselves from ethno-nationalism, or any concern about the people who already resided in the territory?
To my understanding, and this is based off of my attempts at understanding Zionism, I feel it's important, and many Palestinians do, especially those who are active in a liberation struggle. They feel the necessity to understand the opponents, so to speak, because that's what they are in many ways for Palestinians. Um, and in the early days of Zionism, there was a great diversity of opinion on what ought to be done or what the formulation of a state might look like or a homeland. If you go back to even the 1920s, which is not really necessarily the early days, there were even then still debates about what a Jewish homeland versus a Jewish state might look like.
Right.
And even up to the 1940s with the partition plan. In actuality, the partition plan would have if no one was displaced, which is a big if, and certainly something that can never really be counterfactualized. In reality, the Jewish state that was laid out for the partition plan would have had a sizable Arab minority, something like 45%, 40 to 45% of the population. In such a scenario, it would not really have been tenable to create a exclusively Jewish state at the expense of that minority.
Right.
But if you go back further, there were people who argued for binationalism. There were people who, to some degree, whether it was parochial and paternalistic in their view of the Palestinian inhabitants, or whether it was something more of a realist analysis like Jabotinsky, many people understood that what you required if you wanted to establish a demographically majoritarian state of Jews is the emptying out of Palestine, and that Palestinians would reject this. That's certainly what Jabotinsky felt, and that's why he articulated that, well, you can't be surprised, but if you do win, you're going to have to make some sort of settlement. And to this day, obviously, there has been no settlement.
Yeah. So the logic was something like, we are refugees, we need to find somewhere safe to be, and when we get there, we won't be safe until we have some kind of control over the apparatus of the state.
I definitely think so. I think by the late 1930s and by the early 1940s, there had been a solidification of sorts that a demographically Jewish state was necessary. This is something that I think that many Americans and Westerners don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking about, or they don't necessarily even know, because demography is pretty mostly universally coded as a racial thing, a racist thing even. But central to the conflict, going back to the 1890s, 1900s, is demography. The maintenance of a ethnic state, which formulates its constitutional framework, its legal framework, its politics around a racial character, and that's what it is, requires a majoritarian element. And Jews only made up 1/3 of the population by 1947. By 1949, they made up a majority of the population in the 1948 territories. That can only have happened via the emptying out of Palestinians, partly purposeful, partly a matter of war.
But this makes a lot of sense, right? When we conceive that in the late 18th century, early 19th century, we start to develop these racial theories of not only individuals and of groups, but of states. And so it makes sense that Israel, or what would become Israel, really just Europe in the Middle East, it kind of mirrors that European concept of an ethnic state, of a German state, of a French state. This is a Jewish state. There's no difference other than that, as you noted, Layla, there were other people there. But something that really struck me when I was a young person, and I suspect that it's much the same plight as your family went through, is a book that I would recommend to all of our listeners. I don't always do this, but it is The Disinherited, Journal of a Palestinian Exile by Fawaz Turki. And it was written in 1971, and he was a young child during 1948. And so to Layla's point, he talked about the jeeps, the vehicles coming over the land, with microphones, megaphones, saying, like, you got to leave.
Yeah.
Like, you got to leave or you're going to be forced to leave.
So my next question was also relevant to that, you kind of can't remove a population from their home without a lot of violence. And so I wonder if you have looked into kind of what the justifications were that people used to commit that kind of a violence.
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's an excellent book to also perhaps add on to the book suggestions
We're
that
just going
came
to
out.
link them all in the description so people can read them. No
Yes,
problem.
that came out, I want to say 3 years ago. I know that it was recently translated into Arabic and Hebrew last year, but I believe it's by Professor Shai Haskani of the University of Maryland, which is Dear Palestine, A Social History of the War of 1948. And in it, you're seeing these diary entries, these letters, these personal correspondences of soldiers, many of whom come from displaced person camps in Europe,
Yeah.
who have to reckon with what they're doing in 1948, with what's happening on the ground. They've been devastated by the most shocking form of anti Semitic violence in modernity, one of the most destructive forces in Nazi Germany. And suddenly they're telling families to leave, or they're holding people at gunpoint, or they're issuing evacuation orders to villages in what is now central Israel. And in many ways, it's us or them mentality. This is not uncommon. It's a common feature of war. But also, I think in relation to the post-factual justification, what people have done since then, there is a significant and very strong current of mythologizing of the war. For example, many people to this day, in the United States even, say that the Arab states told the Palestinian inhabitants to leave. This ignores that prior to the invasion by the 5 Arab states, which in reality was really 3 in terms of the actual numbers of armies, prior to this, 400,000 had already been displaced. There had already been an ongoing civil war. There had already been violence by Jewish militias, by Zionist militias, and Palestinian militias in turn. And so this mythologizing is meant to, I think, put the burden of flame onto the Arab inhabitants to make it seem like, you know, they left with the expectation that their enemies would be vanquished and they would come back or whatnot. But in reality, they were afraid of being killed. In reality, they were told to leave by armed men. And, they attempt to come back. There's a great many stories. Mahmoud Darwish talks about in his poetry and his biography how his country had been transformed overnight. He eventually became a Palestinian citizen of Israel because he was one of the few who were managed, one of the 200,000 or so who managed to remain. And his country had been transformed overnight. It became an entirely new society, one where he was no longer like his neighbors. And that has a sort of course, traumatizing impact on you. Your families, your cousins, you're no longer able to interact with them.
Yeah. It's a really compelling story to say, like, well, they only left as a strategic move so that we could be destroyed. Guess what? We lived, and now they can't have, now they can't come back. That's simply a myth. But it sounds like exciting, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's something of it. In many ways, I try to make this point partly as a, isn't this kind of funny how all bigotry sounds alike? But in many ways, it kind of sounds like, how people speak of Jews in Europe. Like, look at this perfidious Arab. Look at this, like they manipulate media, they manipulate the historical facts, etc.
They're so sneaky. They're so, crafty, these Palestinians, the way that they, executed something that looked like an ethnic cleansing, but actually it was a strategy. Like that feels very similar to what we hear about the justification for hating Jews in Europe and America, unfortunately. Also, we often get this move, right, of blaming the victims of a genocide or an ethnic cleansing Like, for example, we just saw in the New York Times, Steven Pinker talking about how, it's rude of you to tell me I can't harp on the fact that Africans participated in the African slave trade. Like, we love
Right.
to do this, right? Where we take the object of an exterminationist or otherwise oppressive project and say, oh, yeah, well, they participated in it. So,
Yeah, absolutely. It is, I think, part of our deflection process, right? How we try to protect ourselves from having to take accountability for either primarily or at an auxiliary level being a part of it.
interpersonally, we do it too, right? Like in abuse situations where we say, well,
Right.
you drove me to it, or, you are just messing with me.
Right. Nobody drove you to hurt another person. You chose to do that, and just as states choose to do as they do. Now, right. Well, Layla, we've got to keep on a boogieing because, well, we've
I know I
been.
stuck us in the late 20th
No,
century, early,
no, no,
or
it's fine.
the late
It,
19th century. I mean.
it's fine. We had to lay a groundwork. I mean, obviously, the last 25 years, they could have a whole podcast to themselves, but
Definitely.
we've really seen an acceleration of what I think the hosts of this program, I think speak for both of us, would label as genocide,
Yeah.
as ethnic cleansing. Can you give us a sort of window into what it's been like in Gaza and for the Palestinians?
What we've witnessed, I would say, in the last, I would separate it into two, the last stage and the current stage. The last stage, which I think existed from the late 1980s to roughly 2021, uh, was one in which the world had begun to sense that there might be a solution to this protracted conflict. It began with the Declaration of Independence by the Palestinian leadership by way of the PLO in 1988, in which Arafat and the rest of the Palestinian National Council accepted United Nations Security Council Resolutions 242, which lays out a land for peace framework. Implicitly, this meant that they accepted Israel's existence and demanded a state along the pre-June 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital.
Right.
This was perhaps the beginning of what's called the peace process. After this, the U.S. engaged for the first time in official talks with the PLO, and by 1991, there was an attempt at an international peace conference at Madrid, with the PLO being part of a Jordanian delegation, still part of this scheme of keeping the PLO out, but it was the first time that they were officially part of such talks. This failed. By 1993, there were bilateral talks between Israel and the PLO, and this created the Oslo Accords, the Oslo framework. Contrary to most people's understanding of the Oslo frameworks, this did not produce a roadmap towards partition. If one wants to read a contemporary critic of it, they could go look at Edward Said's criticisms of the peace process, which came out in 1994, 1995, the year after, 2 years after the first Oslo Accord was signed. What the Oslo Accords did was recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people and give it a form of self-government, so to speak, or autonomy under a limited set of parts of the region of the occupied Palestinian territories, Jericho and Gaza for the first part. And it deferred all final status negotiations till later, at an undefined date. Most crucially, the Oslo Accords have never explicitly mentioned the end goal being an independent Palestinian state, and it allowed for the continuation of the settlement enterprise in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. This is where we are today in many senses. By the 2000s, the Oslo framework had effectively collapsed. Settlement has continued. The PLO has fitfully tried to engage in international efforts to compel Israel back to the negotiating table. There were failed and aborted attempts in 2008, 2009, and in 2014. But without any genuine American pressure or quartet pressure, The Israelis have never felt the need to concede on fundamental issues like borders, like the settlement issue, and so on. And so we've been in sort of a logjam. And this is an important part to understanding why October 7th happened. This is a logjam in which the Palestinians are being slowly dispossessed and slowly driven off the land via settlement, via expulsion, and via murder. Prior to October 7th, 2023 was already the deadliest year in the 21st century for Palestinians. More than 200 Palestinians have been killed in the occupied West Bank. This is something that's very rarely mentioned. Sometimes you see people say that there was a ceasefire on October 6th. Well, I'm sure there was for Israeli Jews. There had been no active resistance at that moment. But on October 7th, there was, in the form of what's called by Hamas and the Popular Front and the Democratic Front and so on, these militant factions, Al-Aqsa Flood, in which they sought to invade southern Israel and take military installations and population centers and acquire hostages in exchange for, hopefully later in exchange for Palestinian prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
This was both an attempt to bolster their image in juxtaposition to the Fatah control Palestinian Authority, and also an attempt to upend the status quo, to make it untenable to return to, and to force Western capitals and Tel Aviv alike to understand that the Palestinian issue is not going to go away. And it has not gone away. Today, I think many people in the West and around the world understand that if there's going to be a resolution of Middle East peace, like as people conceptualize it, where everyone sings together and holds hands, it will require an actual legal and political resolution of the Palestinian issue.
Right.
Rather than do that, though, we are now faced with the extermination of Gaza. 80% of the infrastructure is gone, and over 100,000 people are likely dead.
Up to this point, October 7th, I think it's interesting and important to go back to what you said, which is that the year of 2023 had been extraordinarily deadly for Palestinians. And I want to kind of get into a little more detail on that. So in what way were Palestinians being killed?
Certainly. When I say that there was no such thing as a ceasefire on October 6th, I think what people often think of is that there is only one kind of war, right? In which there's two equally belligerent factions of armed forces fighting each other.
Mm-hmm.
But would anyone say that there was would anyone say that there was ever a genuine ceasefire in Ukraine prior to 2022, that is,
Right.
even though Russia was occupying significant parts of Ukraine? I don't think many people would say that. I'm sure there are some idiotic left-wingers who are apologists for the Russians who would say so. But
Always.
no.
Right.
But no. There is no such thing as a non-belligerent occupation. We're talking about 60 years of military occupation in East Jerusalem, which has been annexed illegally, the West Bank, and Gaza. And the form in which this violence takes place is home demolitions, arbitrary checkpoints, arbitrary jailing. Significant percentages of children in the Palestinian territories, in the occupied Palestinian territories, are extrajudicially, illegally jailed by the Israeli occupation. And finally, extrajudicial murder. 200 plus people had been executed by the Israeli state, by the army, in cities like Nablus, in Hebron, in Jericho, in Ramallah, which is the seat of the Palestinian Authority. And these are acts of war. People don't necessarily conceptualize it as such, but that is the case. And in fact, even things that are not conceptualized as violent oftentimes, settlement, according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, is a war crime. The insertion of civilians into territory not sovereign to the state is a war crime, according to the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it might even serve as the basis for arrest warrants by the ICC in the future.
Layla,
So these are acts of war.
why are they not considered acts of war? Why are they not considered violence? Why are they not considered detrimental in the same way that we might conceive of traditional guns and weapons and bombs to be?
I think it's a bit of a twofold thing. I think first and foremost, Arabs in general and Western conceptualization are considered more primal, more primitive, more violent. This is like an Orientalist sort of
Right,
feature of how immediate ecosystem
We
works.
know about this, right? That
right.
even somebody who considers themselves fairly progressive and liberal and not even racist at all still has this idea that it's a more primitive place and that the people there are more animalistic.
Right.
Yes, and but also I think there is this effort to sort of clean up the settlement enterprise. For example, you can see how people think of like settlement blocks in the East Jerusalem area or the Jerusalem municipality area, which is in actuality much larger than the actual city of Jerusalem, as classified by the Israeli state, for the purpose of prohibiting the eventual unification of this area into a Palestinian state. Um, they talk about it as if they're clean suburbs, as if they're places where people are just going because they're being priced out in the Green Line and so on and so forth. And whatever the personal motivations of an individual settler might be, they don't really matter. International law is very clear, and so is the norms of every single country. Even the US, up until the first Trump term, regarded every settlement to be a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, the US has never actually imposed any consequences for this, and has at times even uh, implicitly affirmed the legitimacy of some settlements via the concept of land swaps. Um, these are violent acts. People lived in these places that are being settled, and these places are, legally speaking, the property of a would-be state of Palestine.
So they have the sort of legal interpretation of being acts of war, but I think culturally speaking, or sort of like unofficially speaking, as a regular, only moderately informed white American, I can say that we have given ourselves permission to ignore it because to us it somehow doesn't register, right? As being acts of war or being war crimes or even being ethnic cleansing or genocide, because it is easy to not look at from over here, right?
Yeah, I think I sometimes, and this is a bit of a crude analogy, but I sometimes speak of when I'm speaking to someone who doesn't understand why there is, to say nothing of individual acts of resistance, but why is there armed resistance? Why are there acts of violence from the Palestinian side? There are many reasons, but conceptually, just on brass tacks, if I came into someone's house here in the States
Mm-hmm.
and I held them at gunpoint and said, "This is my house now,"
Mm-hmm.
most human beings would not reply, "You're right, my apologies," and then leave.
Yeah.
Most human beings would say, "What are you talking about? I will fight you, or I will do worse than that." And this is a this is a principle which applies everywhere. It applies in Ukraine. It applies in the Western Sahara. It applies in Palestine. It applies in Taiwan. It applies everywhere. And I think there's a, pardon my use of a pretty uh, cliche thing to say, but there's a progressive Palestine sort of exemption being made here. And that's in large part because people simply think, and this is crude to say, but I think it is true, people simply think that Israel should get an exemption from the international legal norms and customs. And that's, I don't know really how else to say it, but that's intrinsically anti Palestinian. It's a
Yeah.
racial argument.
No, I think that's accurate because we have to do a lot of sort of mental gymnastics to pretend that a huge deal of violence didn't have to happen in order to secure that land for the Israelis. And we also have to have a selective bias about, who's being violent when, right? We have to sort of mangle the timeline, or we have to characterize certain kinds of violence as justified because it is self-defense, even though it is part of a pattern of aggression, really.
Definitely. And I think you can see a pretty clear example of this discrepancy. And I actually think Trent may have written about this before in two cases. One, now granted, eventually this stopped being an issue because of cynical foreign policy objectives. But one, go back and look at how the likes of Biden and the former Vice President Harris and so on reacted to the Saudis' murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Condemnation and straightforward condemnation, straightforward demands that there be accountability, and so on. Eventually, this was dropped once Biden became president out of expedience. But it was easy for them to do so, right? It was easy for them to condemn this because it was done by an Arab dictator, a US aligned one, of course, but an Arab. Compare this to the reaction that the president gave when Israel and its army executed, shot straight in the head, a Palestinian journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh. Oh, well, perhaps it was an accident. Perhaps it was Palestinian militants who weren't even there. Perhaps it was a magical bullet. In fact, look at another example. Last year, it's been so long, time is flying, but the Turkish student who was executed in the West Bank. Biden, in one offhand interview, made up, just magically surmised that perhaps a soldier shot at the ground as a warning and the bullet ricocheted up and entered her skull. And this obviously was not true. Autopsy showed that she was shot in the head purposefully. And from my recollection, no one had even suggested this to him, or the IDF hadn't claimed it.
Well, he's really good at imagining justifications for things, or, like the babies that he definitely saw pictures of, and then it turns out he didn't see pictures of them after all. We've had 180 journalists and media workers killed in the Gaza area, and I haven't really seen a lot of intense disavowal or condemnation of that from the U.S. government. Certainly not this administration, but also not the previous one.
Yes, I think I will say this. I think when people, perhaps your listeners will find it a bit controversial, or maybe they'll agree, but I think when people talk about who's better on Palestine, right, Democrats or Republicans, I think there's largely a missing point there. Certainly, Democrats talk a better game sometimes, and certainly there are symbolic acts which are done by Democratic presidents. Obama was certainly more rhetorically harsh. Biden was certainly, to some degree, more under pressure from his Democratic congressional delegations. But there's a broader point to be made about what U.S. policy is like. There's a continuity going back to Lyndon Baines Johnson of being Israel's lawyer. And that's a term that is from Aaron David Miller, who was a diplomat under the Clinton administration and then under the Bush administration, who worked on the Israel-Palestine portfolio. He admitted in 2005, and has since then repeatedly said, that he often acted more like Israel's lawyer than a neutral arbiter in the peace process. And I think this is the continuity of that we have to understand. This is not necessarily even a partisan issue. There's a broad understanding in the U.S. foreign policy elite that the goal of the U.S. ought to be to adjudicate on behalf of Israel, which is not normal.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that is really not how a moderator or a mediator is supposed to work, right? You're not supposed to be acting on behalf of one of the parties. It defeats the purpose, right? And it's a good point. I think I hope that our listeners will take it well, that it is perhaps falling into kind of dualistic thinking to say, like, well, Republicans are so bad on Palestine that, like, it would be wrong to say that the Democrats are also bad on Palestine. But the fact is that there really is no space right now in our political landscape for anything but at least like a sort of strategic ignorance of Israel's war crimes, right?
Yes, I think there's a widespread deferentialism. There's a widespread lawyering, and I think insofar as what maybe a future administration might look like, perhaps under an AOC, perhaps under someone else,
Mhm.
what is necessary to occur is a complete upending of assumptions, of paradigmic thinking. Primarily, and I think we'll get into this in a little bit based off of what Trent was telling me in relation to Saudi or Iran, there has to be a paradigmic shift, and people have to internalize that in order for Middle East peace to happen, Palestine is actually central to that question rather
Yeah.
than distinct from that question.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate.
No, absolutely, it is because so many fractures have really become deeper since this Palestinian-Israeli crisis, has developed. I mean, as you noted, Layla, it has been 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, depending on how we look at it, and it
Yeah.
is not developing in any positive sense. In fact, we've seen widespread famine and devastation
Yes.
in these specific 2 years almost.
Right.
And of course, we could pivot so easily to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, because, well, we hear about proxies, proxy this, proxy that, Iran acting as a figurehead for proxy figures. Everyone frustrated with Israel. Everyone frustrated with Israel somehow. That's what you hear all the time. But Iran has a lot of reasons to be frustrated in general, just as the Palestinians do, methinks. This is a topic that obviously I've written a lot about over the years. But what how do you see Iran right now? I think we're probably going to have you back to do a
Yeah, this will have
full
to be a two-parter.
yeah,
Yeah.
to do a full Iran Saudi Arabia. But before we head out, what do you sort of see as the circumstances right now for Iran, with America vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, etc.?
I think Iran is in a sort of transitional period with its so-called, with what people conceptualize as the axis of resistance being largely degraded over the last year, except for Israel or the Houthis in Yemen. Uh, and I think they, on the one hand, they may have lost this strategic umbrella to a large extent. But on the other, they've gained quite a lot in relation to the Gulf. Rapprochement has occurred with much of the Gulf Arab states. You have the likes of Saudi and the Emiratis and the rest, Bahrain, so on. They want an Iran nuclear deal back. They want the U.S. to do a bilateral deal, a negotiation, rather than to endorse this wanton and indiscriminate and erratic Israeli strategy of bombing Iran here, bombing Iran there every other year to set them back 6 months or a year on the nuclear program. Um, with that in mind, that's why you're seeing the negotiations now, in large part because of Gulf pressure, in large part because Trump is a sucker for the concept of a deal, um, in large part because Netanyahu doesn't know how to navigate this president anymore. He really didn't either in the first term. Um, he often irritated him with his intransigence. Trump, above all else, loves deals. And it seems like Netanyahu is the primary obstacle. Um, but to your point, to what you've talked about, how you've written for so long, I think the main impediment to any real progress is that there's a deep mistrust between the two countries, the US and Iran, that dates back to the 1950s, perhaps even prior. And if there's going to be a fundamental shift, if there's going to be a paradigmic shift, I actually do think that the nuclear deal and Palestine are interlinked to some degree. I used to think Palestine would have to come first, uh, in some far as like progress, but I think a cooling of relations, a detente, or a thawing rather of relations between the two necessarily is linked to a de-escalation in Iran. Iran
Right.
can't afford to be seen as abandoning the Palestinian issue. Neither can the Arab states. although they often try their hardest. And I think I I go back to it being a transitional period. I don't really know which way it could go, especially with how erratic the president is.
Right.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a great book, America and Iran, by John Gazvinian, and it's about, I guess, 10 years old now, but it's still relevant insofar as it highlights the long relationship and the long fascination that America had with what they considered to be Persia. They weren't familiar that that was just a portion of what is Greater Iran, of course.
Mhm.
And but again, we see these sort of tensions ebbing and flowing. There was one point where, as John notes in his book, that America sees Iran as this sort of um, a almost better Middle East, a nation that has more potential than many of the other nations in its opinion. But Iran also looks at America as sort of a better Europe, a Europe that is not so obsessed with like dominating others. And over the 20th century, that sort of flips on its head, as we see, Reza Shah and Shah Pahlavi, and then of course Mossadegh, and then the Cultural Revolution. I wanted to get to Abu Hassan Bani Sadr, but we'll have to do that in the next discussion
There's
because
Yes,
just too much. There's just too much.
there's just too
there
much.
is.
But again, the Cultural Revolution, what's lost in the eventual victory um, of this very fundamentalist Islamic idea with the Ayatollah, is that this was back in France back in 1976 and 1977. This was like a sort of leftist religious combination thing. We have to get rid of the Shah. He is like bad for everyone. And that history alongside what happens immediately thereafter, right, with Jimmy Carter and with the Shah, who has cancer at this time, but he wants to come into the country, and so we take them into the country, and then the Iranians are like, well, we got to take someone as well. And that begins the whole hostage crisis. And then there's the Iran-Iraq war. And I mean, so much happens to get us to 2008, which I think is a really interesting time because it is the first time that we maybe see, and I'd like your thoughts on this, Layla, maybe like a little bit of optimism for the first time in like 45 years to that point. Um, not 45, 30 years to that point, because now we have a president who is actually interested. And while we still have Ahmed Ahmadinejad, we soon get Hassan Rouhani, who is a much different leader. And can you kind of talk about what happens around that time that gets us to the JCPOA that I've spent so much ink on?
Yes, I, it does sadden me. I think I perhaps was a bit too young to remember it in firsthand, but having read so much, having listened to my elders, having done a lot of research myself, I think a lot of people genuinely do not understand the sort of optimism which existed in '09, '08, '09 in relation to Obama. In the Arab world, in Iran, in the Middle East generally, here is this new, fresh, young face who does not come from the same white background, evangelical background of Bush or any of the previous presidents. Perhaps he can be this new dynamic figure for resetting relations. Maybe he can solve Palestine. Maybe he can solve Iran. And I think obviously he didn't do that per se, but Obama I think did take seriously. I can't necessarily speak to how Rouhani thought about it himself or how the early days worked out. But in the second term, where Obama felt more free, where he felt more in his element, he took a massive risk. with the Iran nuclear deal. He took a risk that upended a lot of assumptions about U.S. relationships to Israel, where Israel had a de facto veto on much of our relationship to Iran. And he engaged in bilateral indirect talks. And we had a deal. We had something that was, for a little bit anyway, maybe something that could build on for some trust. And obviously, it's since been tarnished, and now we're back to the drawing board. It might even get an identical deal, which I think is absurd.
Of course.
If not an identical one that's better for Iran, which
Yeah.
is good for them. It's bizarre. I think it. If I was Iranian, and certainly I feel this way as a Palestinian, I would resent this carpet pull, the rug pull sort of mentality that the U.S. has back and forth. Like, here is this 50-year hostility, and now here's this maybe 8-year handshake, and maybe you're not so bad, and suddenly we're back to, if you don't do what I like, I will carpet bomb Tehran, sort of mentality. And it's not good. It's not good for bilateral relations. It's not a healthy mentality in any international relations context.
No.
So, it's not really a surprise.
Uniquely unstable in that sense? Like, are we more of a yo-yo state than other places, or what's going on there?
I definitely think so, at least in relation to Iran.
Yeah, I would say that it's become less stable over the last, at least 10 years. But that this is sort of, I guess, where we might conceive of leaving it off until our next discussion. It has sort of evolved into this situation where the JCPOA's destruction lays the groundwork for being unable to trust anything that happens in American diplomacy. Because if one president makes a deal, then the next president is not going to honor that deal, then there is no point in making a deal. And this sort of short-sightedness, I mean, I rant about the JCPOA for so many reasons as it concerns short-sightedness, but it all actually hinges upon the trust factor, the very factor that was a positive for it, insofar as giving and taking and this sort of development of trust after these decades of sort of crumbling. Getting rid of it throws the baby out with the bathwater. And now, not only are we not building trust, we've shown we're even less trustworthy than before.
Yes, and I would add very quickly. You've written about this, I know this. And one of the more damning elements of the last 10 years is that after Trump had finished, Biden largely made very little effort to overturn the disastrous precedents Trump set. There was no strident effort to return to the Iran nuclear deal, and there was no strong effort to overturn Trump's moves in Palestine. There was no turn to reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem. The president took over 1,000 days to make the determination that settlements are illegal again. The president maintained recognition of the Golan as Israeli territory in contravention of international law. What this proves, I think, to people in Iran and elsewhere is that Republicans get the set policy and Democrats largely adhere to it out of continuity.
Right.
And that's not good. Obviously, trust is important, but if Democrats don't stand for a policy suite of their own, and if they show themselves to largely just adhere to what the previous president has done, then the foreign parties will only trust what Republicans do. They will think only Republicans can make deals.
This seems like kind of a cross sort of topics, an issue that we're having in this country, right? Which is that one entity will sort of crush the norms and throw out agreements and act in this really chaotic way that doesn't sort of comport with what we expect norms wise, right? And then anytime kind of the Democrats have a chance to undo all of that, they kind of don't rise to the occasion. And so it serves to even further damage our reputation as a trustworthy nation, right? I almost said Nathan. Sorry, Nathans out there. You're all trustworthy, I think. But as a nation, right, we are first destroying our credibility and then failing to restore it in a way that actually destroys it even more. And I wonder if you have a sense of like, do we have a path out of that? Is there a way, like, what would we need to do to sort of restore our credibility as a country? That's a big question.
It is a big question. I think as always, I'll go back to what I know best, which is the Middle East and Palestine. But I think I don't want to say it's simple because it's not. The way we get there is definitely not simple. But I think often of Rashid Halidi's book, 100 Years of War in Palestine, which is an excellent book overviewing the last 100 years or so of the conflict. In his conclusion, he writes, and I think this is basically true, that if the U.S. ever wants, if the U.S. decides one day, if a President AOC or if a President Pritzker or whoever wants to decide that the U.S. will genuinely be a neutral arbiter or will genuinely be someone that can contribute to multilateral thinking in the Middle East, if it wants to work in tandem with the EU and with the Quartet and with the United Nations, then all it really needs to do, and this is a controversial opinion, I know, all it really needs to do is enforce international law and conventions. That's all it really needs to do. It just needs to assert consistently across the board that territorial expansion is illegal, that settlement is illegal, that belligerence is illegal, that attacking embassies is illegal, all of this.
Be consistent about it. It sounds so simple, and yet we keep not doing it.
Yes, and I think it will be a long hill upward. The Arab world, and I would say even the Iranian world, although I'm not Iranian, what they currently see happening is a U.S.-backed genocide. And I think it will be extremely difficult for the U.S. to ever work back from that.
Practically speaking, that's what it looks that way because of the way that it is.
Yes. Right. Yes, I mean, it's I would endeavor say it's just true. Absolutely.
Layla, I can't believe you're saying controversially that the best way for a teacher to keep a good maintenance on the classroom is to enforce all rules equally. That seems unbelievable. Breaking news.
Think it might. As bad as it, as sad as it may seem, I think it'll be more likely that happens now that the U.S. is likelier to become one country among many who have a stake in the Middle East rather than a monopolistic force, because that is really the primary issue. The U.S. has the monopolistic stake on Iran, on Palestine, on relations in Yemen. And once it does not, once there's more of an assert of Turkey, an assert of EU, and whatever one may think, an assert of China, although for the most part, China has been pretty indifferent thus far, there will be more of an incentive to come up with an actual set of rules here.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it does feel like we're seeing other entities like the EU or Turkey like stepping up more so than they have in the past and unseating us as the monopolistic sort of force.
I think it's definitely true in Syria, for example, where the EU was the first bloc to really begin sanctions relief. Turkey has been influential in this regard. The Gulf has been influential in this regard. And I think in Palestine, it's not yet borne fruit, but I do think you're seeing a shift in European thinking. And I think depending on how this conference goes next month, which I am on the whole cynical about, but nonetheless interested in, if France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and so on recognize the state of Palestine, and if they couple this recognition, and this is the important part, if they couple it with sanctions on Israeli activity in the occupied territories, or if they couple it with a trade embargo or arms suspensions from Germany and so on, this could resemble a genuine shift. And I think that would be a welcome one.
Nice. Are you going to cover that meeting on your blog or?
Yes, I intend to. I have written I'm ashamed to say I've written an absurd amount about Emmanuel Macron, who should never be thought about. Thank you for having me on.
Well, you better come back sometime, Layla.
Yeah,
yes,
maybe after.
I look forward to discussing with you, Saudi.
How things have changed, and we want to get into these the relationship between these surrounding countries over the years. I think that's really important to know about, and I really want to thank you for giving us this context and this background, because it is often missing, right? People keep saying like, oh, it's so nuanced, it's so complicated. And it seems like often as a way to dodge actually getting into the details. And so thank you
Right.
for coming here and bringing the details to us.
Thank you very much for having me. And I will say, I don't know when this is going up, but I would recommend all who listen to donate to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. I'll provide a link to those.
Congratulations on meeting your goal on your fundraiser for the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, and happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Y'all have a good day.
You too. This has been Half the Answer, where understanding the question is half the answer. Thanks everyone for listening.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.